Hi everyone, my name is Natalie. I wanted to start off with good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night for some of you that see this last minute. Welcome to this week's presentation. Today I'd like to share with all of you the famous short story of Balthazar's Marvelous Afternoon by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. However, before I begin, I want to showcase a very important quote that you'll all later understand. So this man to the bottom right is Mr. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, very famous author. This quote right here is very important, and you'll later understand. It very much relates to this short story. That quote is, "No, not rich. I am a poor man with money, which is not the same thing." Before I begin with my analysis and summary to Balthazar's Marvelous Afternoon, it would be great for you to all know a little bit about probably, well, to me, one of the greatest Latino writers. This is the place of origin. When looking at Gabriel Garcia Marquez's past, I would like to go far back. Gabo was a unique name that I will be referring to for Mr. Marquez. A lot of people also do refer to him as Gabo or Gabito. Gabriel Garcia Marquez was born March 6, 1927 in the small town of Aracataca, Colombia, which is on the top left-hand corner. You can see that I put a little box around it. Shortly after Gabito was born, his father, Gabriel Eligio Garcia, which would be the middle photo on the bottom, he's the left one, studied to become, and he became, a pharmacist, and moved away with his wife, Luisa Santiago Marquez Iguaran, which is the same photo but on the right, to Barranquilla. He was raised for the first 8 years with his grandparents, Colonel Nicolas Ricardo Marquez and Doña Tranquilina Iguaran, which is the far right photo. However, when Gabito turned 8, he moved with his parents to Barranquilla. Both his grandfather and grandmother played a vigorous role in shaping Gabriel Garcia Marquez into the man he was going to be growing up. The sad part was that the reason why he moved to Barranquilla with his parents was both his grandmother and grandfather passed away. His abuelo was a huge influence on Gabriel. He was also the best source for his stories. Education. So when he moved in with his parents, Gabo was shipped to a boarding school at the age of 8, after, of course, his grandparents had passed away and his parents took him into their home. At the age of 14, he received a scholarship to Jesuit University and graduated in 1946. He was 14, okay, just letting you know that. After graduating, Gabo attended La Universidad Nacional de Colombia, or in English, the National University of Colombia in Bogota, where he was pushed into studying law. But hey, who hasn't been pushed into doing something they don't want to do by their parents? However, having been educated at law, he decided to become a journalist, which brings me to his next slide, his career. In 1950, he moved back to Barranquilla and wrote some columns for El Heraldo, which was a small little paper back in the day. In 1955, he did publish one of his first novelas, Leaf Storm, and also published his second novella, No One Writes to the Colonel, which I personally thought was for his grandfather, who was a colonel. In 1967, he published one of his best-known literary works, 100 Years of Solitude. he did read a lot of literature by many famous writers such as Virginia Woolf, Sophocles, William Faulkner, Franz Kafka, and Ernest Hemingway, a whole lot. And these honestly influenced the way he wrote. He did win the Neustadt International Prize in 1972 and was the first Colombian to win a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1982. They did say that this Nobel Prize was given to him for his novels and his short stories in which the fantastic and the realistic are combined into a richly composed world of imagination reflecting on a Codimant's life and conflicts. No, I did not write that. I took that from an article. Unfortunately, Gabo was diagnosed with lymphatic cancer in 1999. After a successful round of treatment, the disease went into remission. However, just because he went into remission, it didn't really save him as well. He did live for a couple more years, but eventually he died of pneumonia at the age of 87 on April 17, 2014 in Mexico City. I did actually add a couple of photos that were for his memorial, and the yellow flowers, he used to use a lot of yellow roses, which I thought was really cool. Today, Gabo's importance in today's world is based upon his influence on literary factors such as magic realism. One of his quotes was, "I invent nothing. People always praise my imagination, but I believe that I am a terrible realist. Everything I invent was already there in reality," which I personally believe was really, really amazing. So for those who don't know this, magic realism is a literary or artistic genre in which realistic narrative and naturalistic technique are combined with surreal elements of a dream or fantasy. Going on, so the summary to Balthazar's Marvelous Afternoon. So a couple of the characters were Balthazar, which was the main character, Ursula, his wife, Jose Montiel, a very rich man, Adelaide Montiel, the rich man's wife, Pepe Montiel, the rich family, basically he was the son, Dr. Octavio Giraldo, Dr. Octavio Giraldo's wife. She wasn't given a name, just his wife. So the summary, Balthazar had been living with Ursula for 4 years, and no, they were not married, so I guess you could say they were pretty much in with the flow, I guess. Balthazar built a beautiful cage. He then displayed the cage, and the townspeople admired the cage. Because so many people had admired the cage, Ursula had wanted to sell the cage. Dr. Octavio offered to buy the cage for his wife. His wife is actually a big fan of birds and hates cats because cats tend to eat birds. Balthazar refuses to sell it, for he had already sold it to Pepe, or he said that he purchased it for, or he made it for Pepe, sorry. Balthazar takes the cage to the Montiel household. Balthazar finally reveals to Adelaide that Pepe had wanted the cage. Jose Montiel overhears this and grows very angry with Pepe. Jose does not want to pay for the cage. Pepe falls to the floor crying and screaming, and if you want to follow along in the book, then he admitted to a guttural sound like a dog's growl and threw himself on the floor screaming. Page 388. Balthazar noticed it was 4 p.m. Balthazar lets Pepe have the cage as a gift. Jose wants Balthazar to take something from his house in exchange for the cage. No, Jose does not want to give him money. Instead, he said, "Take something from my home." Balthazar had been a little excited because the cage was given to Pepe. He did share with the townspeople that Jose had purchased the cage for 30 pesos. I say purchased because Jose never paid for the cage, but he wanted to tell the townspeople that Jose had sold the cage. Balthazar celebrated by getting drunk, which was weird because Balthazar hadn't gotten drunk or never gets drunk. We have to sell a lot of things to sell to the rich before they die. 12 a.m. had struck and Balthazar hadn't arrived home, asleep on the couch. But he didn't want to abandon the happiest dream of his life. 389, Balthazar's Marvelous Afternoon. This final one was kind of like that magic realism I told you about, that illusion of dreams morphed into reality. I did want to talk about the themes to consider. 6 themes that I found in this short story were greed, pride, lust, envy, wrath, and Balthazar. Now, I'll get back to that, why I have a question mark under Balthazar, but let's start with greed. Greed took form in many ways. The first way greed was presented was in Balthazar's wife, Ursula. You should ask for 60. And if you're following along, you can find this quote about 3/4 of the page down on 384. Another example of greed was the doctor. Knowing well that the beautiful cage had belonged to someone else, he still wanted it. That, I feel, was an example of him being greedy. And of course, the the final one was Montiel. Being the richest man that Balthazar knew, Jose didn't want to release 60 pesos in exchange for the cage. Now, the second theme to consider was pride. Now, pride took a big hit, I like to believe. In the short story, I saw that Jose Montiel didn't want to give money to Balthazar in exchange for the cage. Instead, he offered Balthazar to take anything he wanted from his home, just because he was too prideful to not give anybody money, or his hard-working money. Another example of pride I saw in the short story was Balthazar. He had gone all the way to the house of Jose Montiel to sell the cage, and he wouldn't leave with the same cage, so he gave it to Pepe. Pride was bestowed upon him even more because the only reason he had given it to Pepe was so the townspeople would think that anyone could sell Jose Montiel anything if they really wanted to. And finally, for pride, having bought so many people drinks because he had told people that he sold the cage, made him feel very prideful of himself. Next would be lust. This one was an easy one. Everyone felt lustful over the cage that Mr. Balthazar had shown to everyone. The last one was wrath. There were only 2 characters that showed that theme, I believe. Those 2 would be Pepe and Mr. Jose Montiel. Pepe throwing the biggest tantrum of his life about the cage, and Mr. Montiel, who refused to pay for a cage and refused to accept the cage without having given Balthazar something in return that wasn't money. Now, the reason I put Balthazar as number 6 with a question mark was, this might just be my theme and maybe it's just me, but the last one was Balthazar. This usually related to magic realism. Writers tend to mix magic into the real world. In this case, I feel like the magic was biblical. For instance, the name Balthazar came from the Bible as the king of Arabia, and he gave the gift of myrrh to Jesus. In this case, Balthazar, Gabo's Balthazar, had given Pepe the gift of a cage. Weird, huh? So finally, I want to leave you again with this quote by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or Gabo. and encourage you to read more of his stories. You'll be surprised by how much you'd actually like them. I want to thank you all for listening to my presentation, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Once again, no, not rich. I am a poor man with money, which is not the same thing.